Well, I became interested in the topic when I was doing research in the historic newspapers around the state, and I got particularly interested because of the Carson City paper here, and talking about the development of a baseball team in the community back in 1869. And I had actually run across a couple mentions in 1868 of a team being developed out in Austin, but particularly the Carson City team intrigued me and made me very interested because two of the members who formed this, it was actually a baseball club, were newly hired Mint employees that were going to be working for the U.S. Mint that was going to open here in Carson City in 1870. But they had arrived early and the Mint wasn't ready yet to start full production. So in their off time, in the summer of that time period of 1869, they were out playing catch and hitting the ball out in what was called the plaza, which is where the site of the state capitol is today. It hadn't been built yet. And it just intrigued and excited a lot of the young men in the community. And I'm sure they asked them about the game, and so they decided on June 15th, 1869, to form a baseball club. Well, I think it was when Carson developed their club, and Virginia City had at least this one club that played against the Carson team. And eventually Virginia City would have several clubs because there was a bigger population. But I think it just lent that once there was a team in Carson, that the tendency, or at least the way that these clubs would operate, is they would invite another club to play a match, best 2 out of 3. And so that's what happened. Carson invited the Virginia City Club to play a match, and they had the first game here in Carson to kick off the match in September of 1869. And it's fascinating, I think, how these clubs were organized. They would have a board of officials that would make it up, and then they would have their regular roster of active members or players. And it's interesting, later I came across a team, it was called the O'Shaughnessy's, up in Virginia City a few years later in 1874. Now this was an interesting, again, showing the size of the community versus Carson City here. They had over 100 members, but only a certain number were active ball players. They had, again, their president and vice president, they had their board, but there were a lot of honorary members. And the interesting thing, the honorary members were made up of some of the most prominent names in Comstock history. William Sharon, John Mackey, and Alf Doughton was a famous newspaper man, and others. So it attracted, in this case, which was the largest club I've ever come across, most of them averaged about 25 members, more so like the Carson one. They were pretty much all players, though they did have a few honorary or supportive members. And interesting enough, so you had your core players, and that's what, when the challenge was made, they set up the first match here, and Carson won. Just, in those days, when I give the amount of what the score was, 81-31, people go, that's a baseball score? But you have to realize the way the game was played at that time was different. The field positions, they stayed at their bases, they pitched the ball underhand. It was a hard ball, so you weren't necessarily able to get in front of it and catch it like we do with gloves today. So that all added up to an exciting game. Carson won very easily. One thing to back up to mention was, as I mentioned, this was an invitation. It was very sportsmanlike oriented. You invited the other club to come to your field to play. The Virginia City baseball team came down in a stagecoach. There wasn't, the V&T hadn't been completed, so they came down in the stagecoach, and the first thing that they did that was set up for them was to have breakfast and get a tour of the state prison before they came into town, which I always got a chuckle out of that. They did that, and then once they got to Carson, again, they were met by the Carson Silver Stars baseball team, and they were given these, like a red ribbon or something to notify that they were a visiting team coming in from Virginia City. And before the game started at around 1 o'clock, They were basically given the keys to Carson City. They could have any amount of drink they wanted or any amount of food. They could check out horses to ride. I mean, it was great strategy when you think of it. By the time the game probably started, they were probably pretty tired and pretty full of food and drink. And so they set it up, and the first game was played. And I would like to see, to get maybe one of the last things in the next 10 years that I can get done, I'd like to see a marker out on the Capitol grounds to note that first really baseball game that I think was between two communities, where you had this match developed, and they had it on the Capitol grounds. As I mentioned, the Capitol wasn't completed, so they had a nice level, great field really. And prior to the game, the members of the Carson Silver Stars went out and cleaned the field. They actually had dues that members paid, very, 50, not even 50 cents, I was thinking it was 10 or 20 cents that they would contribute, that was used for things like that to maintain the field. And the day of the game, they had set up a special section just for women to come and watch the game. And so it would have been so exciting. And so I've got my hopes that someday somebody took a picture of just the assembly of the crowd for that special game. So far, nothing has turned up, but in history, you never know. We're always being approached with things that we didn't think would still exist, and yet they're out there and people have them, and they could be anywhere in the country. We've even had things come back from Maine and other parts of the country where relatives had once lived here and then moved away.